I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange. Hey there, spooky nerds. Welcome back to Talking Strange. I'm Aaron Sagers, and happy to have you joining once again. And it's a little bit of a sad occasion as I record this because recently I learned of the passing of Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Now, Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and share some of the information about Jeff. He was a longtime Idaho State University professor, and he's primarily become known for being one of the world's foremost scientists researching Bigfoot. So he was 67 years old. He passed away about 2 weeks ago, and he was operated in the Department of Biological Sciences at ISU since 1993. He taught human anatomy and courses in evolution and primatology. And then, of course, working in the Bigfoot realm, he assembled a large collection of footprint casts, appeared in multiple documentaries and interviews, and really was a educator engaging with the public with these explanations of evidence and method as it relates to Sasquatch. And he really, his main area of focus was focusing on foot morphology and the evolution of bipedal locomotion. He edited From Biped to Strider, The Emergence of the Modern Human, Walking, Running, and Resource Transport. And he also authored Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, which brought the scientific framing to a topic that some people treat more often as folklore or just sort of woo-woo. Going back a little further, he was born in 1958, May 24th, 1958, and he earned his BS and MS from Brigham Young University and PhD in anatomical sciences from Stony Brook University, and then completed his postdoctoral work at Duke University. He also served as editor-in-chief of Relic Hominoid Inquiry, which was a scholarly journal hosted by the university. So that's sort of the official kind of rundown of his accolades. Personally, I'll say I can't claim that I was a close friend of Jeff. What I was, however, and consider myself grateful to be, was a contact, a colleague, friendly, for years, going back to 2011 at least, that I can think of. Jeff was always quick and readily available for emails, for questions, big and small, that I might have. He offered information on background for, on the record. He was just available, and he was really someone that I understood how protective he was of his scholarship, and was very aware and careful not to be painted in a unflattering light with regards to his studies into Bigfoot. But he was great about breaking down sort of why this creature is possibly out there, or out there, as he contended. So always quick with some emails, and I was always honored to interact with him, and I wish I had done it more. And that's unfortunately sort of the 2020 hindsight. Someone passes away and you're like, man, I wish I had sent one more email out to Jeff, or had reached out to that person a little bit more. So I am feeling a little bit sad about that, about losing Jeff, and about losing Jeff as a person who I think was a great educator and really good for this field, and just a cool guy by all accounts that I understood, but also losing his scholarship and being able to communicate these ideas to the public. So I think probably the best way to I can remember him today and to share it with you is to replay an episode that of Talking Strange that we recorded. And we recorded it for the anniversary of the Patterson-Gimlin footage, and we talk a lot about that and why he considers that to be valid, verifiable footage, credible footage of a Sasquatch. And yeah, so we have a long chat. And yeah, so let's do this. I'm gonna share this interview as a bit of a bit of a flashback, not too long ago, only 2022, with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. And again, big loss. He's passed away. Big loss for the paranormal community, for the Sasquatch community, and for science at large. A guy that was going out there, pursuing things that his colleagues might say, man, don't touch this. This is going to make you look bad. No, he pursued the science and established himself as such a credible authority on this topic. So let's throw it to this interview from 2022 with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. Hey, Dr. Meldrum. Jeff, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. I'm quite excited to chat with you today, and we've got a lot of things that I want to go through. But actually, just something that, as I was saying it, I wanted to get your definition of what this means, because you explore the contemporary scientific evidence for the reality of Sasquatch, but you also afford deference to tribal people's traditional knowledge of this subject. That's very specific wording. I like that. And I kind of want you to break that down a little bit more and define what you mean by contemporary scientific evidence and also the deference to tribal people's traditional knowledge.
Well, sure. Well, it was always annoying when the skeptics would tout that Bigfoot was born in the late 1950s, when these yokels were trotting out carved wooden feet and stomping footprints in the logging roads, as if nothing had happened prior to that, as if there was no trace of relic hominoids or wild men or whatever local names, the boogers, the monsters, the devils, the mountain devils, all these different terms that seem to apply to this same entity, as if all that never existed. And so the appreciation and understanding of the tribal perspective has always been a bit elusive itself, because of the very guarded nature of these traditions and rituals and costumes and dances and so forth. And so when I was writing Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, the publisher that I was working with commented on the lack of any representation and suggested it would really be great if we could add a chapter beyond the outline that had been followed for the documentary, add a chapter that addressed the Native American traditions and knowledge, perspective, point of view, however you want to describe it. And so I had some material that I had accumulated just through direct interaction with local tribal members. We live very close to the Fort Hall Reservation, and so representation of the Shoshone and Bannock tribes there. I worked closely with an investigator, John Meinzinski, who has very close ties with the Eastern Shoshone, the Wind River Reservation, and other examples. And so I frequently interacted as well with students that were from the reservation and that were taking classes, who would share their insights. And so I had a few things, but there really was it became clear very quickly, there was no really systematic treatment of the topic across all the various tribal nations. And because of the guarded nature, the reticence of these communities to share this information with non-tribal communities. There was, however, a very good paper written by Gail Hypine, who a tribal person herself, who had access to and was afforded the opportunity to create kind of a synthesis across quite a geographic range in North America, and it had been disseminated in a couple of websites or this or that. And I contacted Gail, and she was very gracious in permitting us to reprint that piece in its entirety in Sasquatch Leisure Meets Science. So that was a really significant contribution, I think. And things are slowly changing, though. For example, I'm working on one of the projects that is vying for my attention, and I wish I could devote more time to it in an uninterrupted fashion, but I'm co-authoring a manuscript with a cultural anthropologist at the University of New Mexico at Gallup, who has very good ties with the Navajo Nation. And they are very willing to share their perspective and insights to a serious investigator. And we, in fact, the way I came into connection with this project was Chris, that the anthropologist had invited me down. He was at that time the executive director of the Gallup campus of the university, and had hosted a symposium on Sasquatch in the Southwest. And I was one of the invited speakers. There was a local investigator who made a contribution as well. But the real highlight of the event, which was a gatebuster, it was the most attended event that had ever been held on that university campus ever. We had to change the venue twice to accommodate the burgeoning crowd, of which the vast majority were from the Navajo Nation. And the second day was entirely an open mic kind of talking circle setting, which once the ball got rolling for about 4 or 5 hours, it was nonstop sharing of personal anecdotes or perspectives, tribal perspectives, interpretation of traditional knowledge and so forth by tribal members. And that really kind of planted the seed, I thought, because they were also, all the audience agreed right up front to allow it to be audio taped. And so we had all those testimonials and stories and perspective. And I thought this would be a great kernel, a core for a treatment of this topic on a broader scale. And here we have, a cultural anthropologist and a biologist in the broadest sense, and an physical anthropologist. And so I tackled the sort of biogeographic, ecological side of it, and Chris much more of the ethnographic side of it. So it's well underway. It's just we've, as all things happen, it seems that life gets in the way, life and obligations here, and so I'm hoping that at the very least, come spring, midsummer, we'll wrap that project up, because it's just fascinating. You think this is one of the things, a theme that I think is really fascinating, because it so attests to the reality of this species, as opposed to just being some paranormal phenomenon. It has an ecological basis. And so as I'm breaking down the forest and the forest types and the natural resources that a large omnivorous primate would need to survive, looking for parallels with the distribution of black bear, for example, in the area. Where are the montane forests? Because most people, you think of the Southwest, the Four Corners, and what do you think of? You think of the desert. You think of saguaro cactus and red sandstone mesas and hoodoos and rimrock and so forth. You don't think about a forest creature like this, but yet the habitat is there, and it rings that Colorado plateau. The plateau itself, even though not densely forested, is extremely rich with gamble oak and pinyon pine, which are tremendous carbohydrate sources, and of which the the bear are known to take full advantage of. In any case, I happened to, as part of this project, um, uh, run into and establish a working relationship with a map maker, the Bigfoot Mapping Project, and asked if he had acquired numerous other data sets in addition to, kind of the go-to, the BFRO .net maps,
Right.
and he prepared this fantastic map of the Four Corners area. And when you overlay that on my ecological map that shows where the likely habitat would be, the potential habitat, as correlated also with black bear habitat, boom, there's a 99% correlation.
Yeah.
They just fit. They overlap tremendously. Go ahead.
I know. I just want to backtrack just a moment because when you're talking about these tribal peoples, I mean, even though the approach that you're taking is very much looking at this as a physical species, the
Right.
interesting intersection with quote unquote the paranormal is a lot of people of color, indigenous peoples, their stories have been co-opted and exploited by, white folks that go into those communities, and then they take those stories and then they will, use that to paint those people in whatever unflattering way they choose. And as a result, those communities, I think understandably, might kind of close ranks and decide not to talk about these stories with outsiders. And then there's like a lot of repair work that has to be done. So we're kind of finally at this point, more than half a century after this thing really started becoming part of the mainstream, we're finally at the point where we think the indigenous peoples are maybe a little bit more willing to buy into this research on the academic level and work with you.
Absolutely. And, I've had very positive experiences, and I hope through my, serious and calculated, in terms of objectivity and scientific rigor, treatment of the subject, I've garnered, I think, the respect of the tribal peoples that I'm treating this with respect. And whenever the opportunity to interact has arisen, have always shown deference to the significance, the role, because there are layers. I was actually kind of challenged by, I had an audience before the tribal council here on the Fort Hall Reservation in connection with, I was seeking just a nod of approval and acknowledgement that I had treaded lightly in my treatment of the topic in this particular chapter. And it was a very soul bearing and searching experience, I think, on both levels, on both sides of there was certainly give and take, but there was this at one point the challenge: why are you doing this? And I tried to explain that there isn't just one reason. I mean, as an individual, I wear different hats. And so as a scientist, I am striving to further understand the natural world, to catalog the diversity of nature, to understand on a personal level. I'm to the point where I've had these firsthand experiences that I want to better understand. If there is more than just this, as an anatomist, I study the human body. I study the machine that we occupy, that serves us throughout our life. That doesn't mean that there are all these other dimensions of humanity that my preoccupation with human anatomy fails to even touch. And likewise, when I'm focused as a physical anthropologist on the the supposed evolutionary history and adaptations and the form and function of the foot of the Sasquatch as I interpret all these casts, that doesn't mean that my perception of this being is limited to those physical parameters. I mean, there's all this other, the mystique of an unrecognized species, the one perhaps more closely related to us than any other on the planet. And what kind of a mirror does that hold up to us as a species, and so on and so on. I mean, there's all kinds of philosophical aspects. And so, of course, the Native American perspective tends to obviously be heavily into that side, that sort of experiential and philosophical and existential types of questions, instead of the very proximate physical, mechanical aspects of it. But there is common ground, and I have, in my interactions with peoples from all kinds of backgrounds, have found those common points of interest. That one of the things, and to kind of turn it back around, not to be judgmental at all, but the reality of it is that part of the motivation for the more open and reciprocal relationships with people like me is that the younger generation, many that come up and talk to me, they know more about Sasquatch based on their watching of cable television than they do sitting at the knee of their elders. And they're recognizing that they're going to lose that link in the chain of tradition,
that cultural connection.
Exactly. If they don't take a more proactive role in the process. And so, it was quite interesting. We just had an event here in Pocatello that was organized by one of our local entrepreneurs and Sasquatch enthusiasts, Brandon Tennant, and at the very last minute, and he had tried to get, given the proximity, get involvement and participation. It kind of waxes and wanes, as is always the case, depending on which personalities are on the stage and are on the fore and involved, as to how much communication. But at this particular point, there was no interest in participating from displayed from the tribe. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, this new individual who was a recent arrival in this community, she'd been away at different roles, different career paths that had taken her into, she was a Forest Service archaeologist, U.S. Forest Service archaeologist. And she asked if she could participate and provide a perspective. So he quickly carved out of the schedule a slot for her to have the stage. And she was prepared with a slide presentation, everything, gave a nice little presentation about her perspective and reiterated some of the same traditional stories that I've heard over and over again. But it was a great experience for the audience to see that perspective and to realize that, and she was very deferential. Obviously her education and her career path was in a science, even though that science was indeed applied to her own history. And sometimes that creates tensions that, that I'm sure she's had to navigate hurdles and obstacles to her involvement. But it was a great experience.
Well, yeah, that kind of brings up something I was wondering about is, so you were you've been with Idaho State University since 1993, and it's not as if you came at this as someone that entered academia trying to look into Sasquatch. My understanding is that it was 96 is when you first encountered these 15-inch tracks in the Blue Mountains in southeastern Washington, and this is what really sparked your interest. Now, I correct me if I'm wrong, but the question I really have about that is, do you recall the first conversation you had with an academic right after that? The sort of after you have this paradigm shift, that first kind of collegiate contact or conversation you had where you're like, yeah, you know what? I might be pursuing this thing now.
Yeah. Well, yes, I not in generalities, I guess. There were, thankfully, there were a couple of colleagues in the department who were always very supportive and very, good mentors. They were more senior members of the department, and I can remember sharing some of the things that were occurring with them, and to very clear curiosity and interest and enthusiasm. And they were always very supportive as I undertook to pursue this path more depth of investigation. It is admittedly a very polarizing topic, and in the department, it literally split. It evolved extremes. Let's put it that way, because I don't know. I guess it is fair because there were votes when it came to bids for promotion and so forth, and in those votes, it was almost a 50-50 split within the department. Yay or nay. And but obviously there are very vocal elements at the extremes, whereas most of the faculty, as good faculty usually are, they're very busy with their own plate, and they aren't so overly concerned about what you're doing unless it particularly interests them. And so the very positive interest represented those types of people, whereas the very negative elements, they saw me as an embarrassment. They saw me as a bane on the reputation of the department and the university, and so forth and so forth. So, it was, it was it was what it was. I hate to spend too much time. It seems like frequently in these conversations, we come upon that thread, and I hate to pull on it too frequently, because while I think it's very important, and I think it's a story that needs to be told, because it does reveal. I mean, it's like when when you read an article in the newspaper about a topic that you know a lot about, or about yourself, and you see how sometimes you're represented, or the topic is represented in such a skewed, such a misrepresented way, then you become very leery about trusting anything that's written in the newspaper about any topic. How far off are they on those things? How much can you rely on that source? And so the experience that I've had with this topic in, as Dr. Krantz would call it, the scientific establishment, has been a real eye-opener. And it has reiterated some things that I've, suspected. Human paleoanthropology is a very politically charged area. And it's always had that reputation. Very dynamic personalities involved, it seems, and very limited until the recent rapid accumulation of lots and lots of fossils. There was always a very few points of departure for meaningful conversations about the nature and pattern of human evolution. Well, but it also, I hate to become cynical, and I've resisted that vigorously as I've gotten older. With age comes this retrospective point of view, and a much broader depth, a broader and deeper spectrum of experience, and you come to realize that there's a lot of nonsense that goes on. There's a lot of very vacuous expressions of ignorance on a lot of topics, and it's like, wow, is that, you hope you've made a meaningful contribution yourself and have furthered the pursuit of truth and the realization of reality. But boy, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I'll just leave it there. So it's a story to be told, but I just wanted to say that there's always this, the flip side. There are so many very positive things that have come out of my involvement, in spite of the negative. There are so many collaborations, so many interactions with people, like having Jane Goodall make a statement that appears on the cover of your book. That's a pretty amazing, and even perhaps more valuable to me is the foreword to my book, written by none other than George Schaller, who might not have the name recognition as generally outside of the science, but I mean within science, he's the naturalist's naturalist. He's the naturalist of our century in many ways. And, there have been those kind of things. And then all the interactions and collaborations that have occurred largely behind the scenes, because there have been very few people who have gone out on the proverbial limb to the degree that I have, especially at the point of my career that I did. Most sort of linger in the closet until retirement, and then they come out ready to go full guns, only to suffer a heart attack or contract cancer or some other terrible malady that takes them out of the game before the play's even begun for them. So that's so take home message is don't retire.
Right.
Keep at it.
Pursue those interests as soon as you can. How from your perspective, just anecdotally, well, not even just anecdotally, you get a lot of reports in. How has interest in this topic increased or even decreased in the last few years, specifically during the global pandemic? And I guess sort of the parenthetical to that is certainly there's I have noticed an increase in the commercialization of things with Bigfoot slapped all over it, and maybe not a ton of shows out there about Sasquatch, but there's a handful of them. So how has interest increased, decreased in this pandemic time?
Yeah, well, I have only a very subjective, perhaps, impression of that, but like you, I've noticed the proliferation of documentaries and podcasts. I think in the pandemic, people really discovered the ability to put their own message out, their own spin on the topic out, and so those have proliferated. I mean, there were months during the pandemic when I was doing it. I finally learned to say no, or to put it off a little bit. I was doing 4 or 5 podcasts, or not just podcasts, but other institutions also discovered the utility of Zoom. And so I was doing lectures in university classrooms, grade school classrooms, high school science classrooms, library events, museum events. It was just amazing how the quantity, and that was great. I mean, and the networks, the cable networks, have always had their finger on that pulse. And this is, it's been told to me numerous times by producers, this is an evergreen topic. People are just fascinated. I mean, my own, documentary that inspired my book was a case in point, and that was years ago. Pardon me. But the documentary Sasquatch Legend Meets Science was due to be airing shortly, and the Wallace story broke. The notion that all these footprints were made by these carved wooden stompers by the Wallace.
Ray Wallace?
Yeah, Ray Wallace and his clan traipsing around in the forest.
Even just for context, that Wallace even claimed to have some involvement tangentially, but some involvement with the Patterson-Gimlin footage, and and then he died in 2002. But his family claimed that they even had a hand in helping create these tracks. Which
absolutely, yeah, and they were laying claim to having made all of, or the bulk at least, all of the tracks. I mean, they allowed, there were probably some copycats out there, but they had invented Bigfoot. And in fact, they even got to the point where they were asserting that indeed it was their mother, the matriarch, Mrs. Ray Wallace, in the costume on the Patterson-Gimlin film.
That she indeed is Patty.
Yes, all 5'2" of her.
Right.
And so anyway, that story broke in its initial iterations and then went around the globe like the telegraph game. Party game, and it with each retelling getting more elaborate and more extravagant. The person in charge of publicity and public relations at Discovery was so chagrined by this, so concerned that they were going to look like they had egg on their face, that here they had this big documentary, high-powered documentary that now had been shown to be about something that was totally fake. He pulled all the publicity. He did everything short of lobbying for the cancellation of the airing of the show. And yet, when it aired, it took in the largest viewer segment in the history of that network, just by word of mouth, without any expense for publicity. I mean, they should learn something from that, perhaps, huh? But it's the case, it seems over and over again, that there's just so much interest in the topic that, and for good and ill. I mean, that and the ability to self-publish books now. We've seen this plethora of self-published books, which is can be a boon or a bane, depending on the individual examples. I mean, some are great, some are fantastic little regional synopses of events in a particular area, which I find very useful and very informative. But others are quilted hodgepodges of everything else that had already been published, just repackaged, and others could really use a proofreader and editor.
Well, and you also, it seems like you're in a challenging situation because you're both trying to conduct serious research and elicit serious consideration for this research and for the existence of this species. But you also, even though it's not solely on your shoulders as a member of this community, for better or worse, you're also having to be in a situation of combating hoaxes and the incorrect information, the people that are trying to actively peddle the incorrect information. So I guess that, with that said, are there some popular stories or anecdotes or even kind of notions about these creatures that you would like to dispel, to see go away, that just retire entirely? So maybe characteristics or even so-called popular stories of these sightings that you would like to see go away.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would be hesitant to presume to sort of sit here as the final arbiter for that kind of a question, but rather I think promote. I mean, this is maybe a good opportunity to push a theme that I have given a lot more attention to recently, and that is to cultivate good practices of objective investigation. The notion of citizen science, people who are not formally trained or credentialed in a scientific discipline, but yet are, have to put it bluntly, common sense about the world around them, and a curiosity that they can discipline according to some of the methodological approaches and strictures and expectations, responsibilities of science. And we've even gone so far in the recent reorganization of the editorial board of the Relic Hominoid Inquiry to add a representative of citizen science, an editor, a non-academic, and it will be her role to help to foster submissions of individuals conducting their own research, work with them, help them to try to meet the expectations of standards of objectivity and rigor in order to have make a meaningful contribution. Because, so much of this is, you look at the sightings, the encounters, the reported encounters, the bulk of those that are credible, at least, that have perhaps some corroboration, they happen by chance. They don't happen through intent. There's very few people like myself who go out and there are lots of people like myself that go out, but there are few people amongst those that do go out intentionally that have legitimate experiences or to find real bona fide evidence, unless you put in a lot of time and are very systematic and methodical in your approach to the science. These people who go out, these weekend warriors who go out and have activity on a weekly basis, which usually boils down to bumps in the night or inexplicable tree structures or glyphs on the ground, the cluster of twigs or this or that, things that are very questionable, which then through repetition become somehow affixed, associated as evidence of Sasquatch activity. And it gives them the opportunity to have that affirmative experience, which otherwise is so remarkably rare that, I can't think of a good metaphor, panning for gold or whatever, catching that trophy fish or something.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen much.
But it's tricky. I find, in my opinion, is that I see what you're saying. It's a rare situation, a rare interaction. So if you're having the weekend warriors go out and then they present the bumps and the knocks and say, I had an experience. Yeah, I don't want to, I don't want to affirm that, but I also don't want to dismiss it, because if on some level this now has further spurred some sort of interest and openness to the topic, then that could be a positive thing. However, we also don't need more Facebook scientists out there claiming that, okay, now I'm a cryptozoologist because I've watched a lot of TV shows and I've gone camping and hunting for Bigfoot. I don't quite know what that balance is there. I mean, are there any, react to that, but also give me some bullet points of what you would say to Joe Q public on, if they're going to look at this footage, things to think about, questions to ask, whether it's YouTube videos or something that they're experiencing themselves in the woods. Right.
Well, and exactly. And you hit right on the point and said it more succinctly, precisely than perhaps I did at the beginning. But by demurring from setting myself up as the arbiter, while I'm very critical and I hold to a very high standard claims, for example, of the paranormal, as opposed to a normal explanation. But it's like, what is paranormal? What we label paranormal today is simply perhaps what we just don't understand. We don't have the empirical basis to accommodate it in our normal worldview yet. But we could name off things which 50, 100, 150 years ago would seem outrageously paranormal, other than
not currently defined by science.
Exactly, outside of our normal sphere of experience. So anyway, but here's the thing, and this is where, as an educator, I try not to too often step up on my soapbox, but one of my pet peeves has often been, and I try to convey this to students because it's so abused, and it's so abused in this arena particularly, it seems, but it's Occam's razor, what people know as Occam's razor, which is often misstated as the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one. And that's not at all what Occam's razor is about. Occam was a philosopher of science, and the original expression was basically, paraphrasing it in a loose translation, is one is not justified, or one should not unnecessarily multiply factors in an explanation. Because what he was getting at in the fundamentally in the philosophical approach to science, it's recognized that it's impossible for us to test every possible condition, every possible variation. And so instead of trying to prove everything positively, if we can demonstrate a single exception, that knocks the legs out from underneath our hypothesis, or at least draws our hypothesis into reconsideration, and then we're justified to elaborate, to try to accommodate, to explain why this exception exists. And so it never was intended to bias opinion about the complexity of explanations toward simplicity, because if anything, nature teaches us, especially biology, is that most explanations are far from simple. Mother Nature doesn't have a crystal ball, so doesn't possibly know what the straightest line between 2 points is. And so the path, when viewed with 20/20 hindsight, is this meandering, wandering path that varies with the current circumstances at the moment. But where we end up with in our future present is unknowable. So anyway, the point being, when approaching this topic, then, not to say that the simplest explanation is most likely to be true, but if I can accommodate my observations within a simple explanation, I'm obliged to hold on to that explanation rather than appeal to or resort to a much more elaborate, convoluted explanation until such time as I experience exceptions that seem to disqualify that simplistic view of it. And from my point of view as a physical anthropologist, I can accommodate the experiences that I have had, at least, within a concept of a biological species of large bipedal primate, whether a hominoid, an ape, or an early hominin like a paranthropus or something like that. Nothing that I've experienced would justify me leaping to the explanation, or to the conclusion that, say, since I found no bodies, they must not reside here. They must be coming from another dimension or stepping out of a UFO or this or that or the other. I've never seen a Bigfoot walk along and suddenly transform into an orb of light and bounce off into the forest. I'm not saying that others haven't, but then the burden is on them to demonstrate that evidence, that observation through documentation and replication and so forth. In other words, if we're going to hold it up to a science, you can't have your cake and eat it too. In other words, you can't defy the norms of science, but then expect science to take you seriously and respect the assertions that you're making. You're going to have to adhere to the expectations, the requirements of science if you want a science to endorse it. And there are those who just throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I couldn't care less what science thinks. I've had my experience. I know what I know. But yet they want everyone else to believe that what they know is in fact reality, when it's a personal experience, a personal subjective interpretation of their supposed experience.
It's gotten a lot more complicated in the last couple of years too, I would say, not just for this topic, but just everything.
Right.
But
yeah, so you're absolutely right. But I mean, it's a bit of a minefield because you're always dancing around this uh, uh, this possibility that, well, the first step that you're then required to take is to try to evaluate what are the prospects that this is simply a hoax. I mean, not jump to that conclusion, but you have to be able to eliminate, that possibility. Because in some instances, that is the simplest explanation. And so you got to start there. And before you can leave that, you have to demonstrate why this couldn't be simply a hoax. Then what is it?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like I think even for people that want to believe and are on the side of, yeah, this is quite possibly out there, even when they see something, because we're ingrained to be not even just skeptical. Skepticism can be a good thing, but cynical.
Sure.
That even the people that are on the side are like, nope, it's a hoax. And it's like,
Right.
well, give it a second here. Let's evaluate this a little bit. I sometimes find the people that are the so-called believers are
Yeah.
the hardest to convince.
Yeah,
And
that's true. That's true. That's true. And whether that's based on a sense of personal knowledge that they've acquired, that has given them some insight that the average person may not. They think the average person doesn't have. I mean, basically, it comes back to this obligation of establishing a set of criteria, and and whether that's a foolproof method or not. There are some people out there online, and I won't name names, but there are some people out there online who are very good at that. They establish a set of criteria. There was well, I'll name one that because it goes back and it's not anybody that's out there that I'm aware of right now. I haven't had any interaction with, but there was this Facebook Find Bigfoot site, which for a long time welcomed submission of videos, and I must say it was it was interesting to see the spectrum of quality of video. But to their credit, whether it was, like I said, foolproof or not, they quickly kind of established a set of criteria that formed a basis for evaluating and ranking the possibility of these being credible pieces of video or photographic imagery, and it also became clear quickly that these weren't all on par. The quality, the amount of information content, and so forth varied tremendously. But and it was interesting. He would rank them according to this evolving set of criteria, and his top 20. When you went and looked at his top 20, no one of them. I mean, and the thing about this is the Patterson-Gimlin film has set the bar so ridiculously high for all these others that they fall so remarkably short. But any one of them, as I said, was not that impressive. But when you started to see them in series, and there were repetitive little pieces where these various criteria would show up time and time again, whether it was the posture of the head on the shoulders, the massive traps, whether it was the way the hand was carried, the way the high lift, the angle of the shin, the tibia, all these little things like that, both anatomical and behavioral and circumstantial, that it started in its totality. It started to make a really compelling case that, hey, there's something for which there is some consistency that keeps floating to the surface in so many of these, that there must be something out there. So many of them were just, again, by happenstance. They weren't intentionally videoing a Sasquatch. They were videoing, the barbecue in the backyard or the cabin, and then on the ridge line or behind the tree steps a Sasquatch photobombing them.
yeah, and I, honestly, I've seen a lot of videos, and the happenstance ones, and how people react and how the rest of the environment seems to be reacting. That's the stuff that I find compelling. Doesn't necessarily automatically make it the winner, but it makes it compelling
Right.
to me. I mean, so far right now, and I want to keep you for a few more minutes if I can, but it seems like the Skookum cast from 2000, we've got footprints, we've got looks like a buttocks, thigh print. There's as if this creature is leaning down and picking something. So we have that, and then we have Patterson-Gimlin as two pretty high marks. Are there other benchmark casts or video footage that you wish more people could know about? I mean, call them out right here.
Sure. Oh, sure. Well, recently, one of the members of the staff out at the North American Bigfoot Center, Cliff Berkman's museum, Connor, has done some really great stuff with the Freeman footage, which is featured in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, is up there, I think, pretty close. I mean, it's video, and so the quality, the image content is less. But Connor has done some interesting things, delacing the fields, and they went up and were actually able to very conclusively determine the exact location. I mean, even reproducing the footsteps, the footfalls and the distance between steps with the actual scale then established. And it's impressive. I mean, it stood probably just a little over 6.5 feet tall. And not towering up there at 7.5 feet, which accords well with the footprints, which are very similar in size and proportion to Patty's. And that's about the size that Patty seems to be coming in at, right between 6.5 and 7 feet, somewhere in there. So the redwoods, or the Freeman footage is one that I think will now get some renewed attention through the analysis that Connor's leading. I mean, there are so many examples of footprints, and I think it'll be really interesting from that same region. Michael Freeman, Paul Freeman's son, is it should be out, if it's not now already, it should be out shortly, has put together with some help from Doug Hychek and contributions from a number of other people, providing some historical context, some never before seen images of some of the footprint casts and some of the historical aspects of Paul Freeman's decade-long investigation. That stuff still ranks up there, despite detracting comments by a number of naysayers, as some of the most significant evidence. There were people need to realize when they look at the King Midas appearing quantity of data, that Paul was just a dogged investigator every spare moment, and even moments he didn't have to spare from his family and job. He was up there in the woods in an area where the conditions were remarkably unique in many ways, in that the local soil content of this glacial loess, this it's sometimes called glacial flour. It's like flour in consistency. The sediment is so fine, and many of these tertiary roads that were cut into the mountains there were nothing more than graded roads, dirt roads. There was no improvement, no gravel beds, whatever. And so the potential for, and then the cultivated lands, they cultivated right up to the national forest boundary. So there are always seasonally these fallow fields with tilled soil, soft soil that would take footprints really well. And so Paul and others, Paul wasn't the discoverer in every case. Sometimes he was informed by other people once he had some notoriety as a result of his first encounter and the publicity associated with that. But this is an area that has yielded a remarkable footprint record with repeat appearances of recognizable individuals. The first documented and published consideration of dermatoglyphics, which is in part a result of the very fine soil substrate, material that's been studied, looked at, examined, including hair samples, by more PhDs than in any other location.
Wow.
Dr. Fehrenbach, Dr. Krantz, myself, Leroy Fish. There were other, I mean, he's not a PhD, but he was a professional wildlife biologist, and other people that have visited that site or have looked at the materials. Dr. John Bindernagel, who spent a couple days in my laboratory going over these footprint casts in great detail, and so forth. So yeah, there's still lots and lots of evidence.
Well, I have an academic question. Well, actually, I have a question about, first off, the government involvement. And it sounds like I'm about to ask a crackpot conspiracy theorist question, but I'm not, because I was going to say, do you think the government has actively studied this matter and simply hasn't been forthcoming about it? We know that in 1969, I think it was a Smithsonian reached out to J. Edgar Hoover to investigate the Hansen Iceman, and he declined, according to what we know. Huh. So do you think the government has actively studied this matter and just simply hasn't been forthcoming? Because we now know that even when they said that they were not looking into UFO/UAP, they were.
Yeah, that kind of changed the landscape, didn't it? Right, and on that basis, and so many other examples similar to that, I think it would be naive to say that it's impossible that there has been no government involvement. My own personal experience, and that's what I can speak from with authority, is that the only anecdotes I could share are those that involve sort of middle management personnel who are motivated usually out of either concern for personal reputation. They don't want this scandal to take place on their watch, or fiscal responsibility, integrity. They're concerned, or at least I guess it's still under the first category. It's more out of concern for public perception of the application of public funds, chasing wild geese, and so it's those have been the motivations where obstacles have been put in the path of any type of institutional involvement. John Meinzinski, that I've worked with very closely, has shared repeatedly his experience, and it involves that, not upper level. Along the same lines, John has interacted with people employees of the National Park Service at Yellowstone, who have had experiences, and some have published some of their experiences and they have become widely known. But it's interesting, and they were always talked about the reticence, the reluctance to formally report these experiences or encounters for fear of retribution and or stigmatization and so forth. One time, John shared with me an experience. One time, he was interacting with the director of public relations at the Yellowstone National Park, and as he's so skilled at doing, he has a knack for turning the conversation at a given point to this question to try to fathom, their interest or their any knowledge nuggets of insight they might provide. Anyway, he was mentioning about his involvement in some of the research into the question of Sasquatch, and she says, "Oh, that's very interesting. We don't have anything happen like that here in the park." And he said, "Oh, as a matter of fact, you do." She said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, many of your rangers have experiences, but they don't feel at liberty to report them up the chain of command for fear of retribution." And she said, "Really?" She was just totally oblivious. So, I mean, it shows that I think that there is this disconnect, and it suggests to me that there isn't an orchestrated official policy, that there are usually policy making by individuals concerned about their reputation, concerned about their career security, and so forth. And I could, repeat, there have been numerous examples of that kind of thing. No men in black have shown up at my office and rifled through my files. No one's ever snuck into my lab and confiscated any evidence, any hair, footprints, or anything. So, I had a good laugh one time because this type of question came up. We were in a panel at one of the conventions. And so when the mic was handed to me, I said, well, I guess it's time I came clean. I'm actually a federal agent, and I've been tasked with dispersing disinformation to keep you all off the track of the real origin of the Sasquatch. Got a good laugh from the audience, but something to that effect.
Well, what would it take though for a New York Times level of interest, similar to what we have now seen with the UFO UAP topic, and for this discussion to be treated with a newsy look, a serious look, legitimate coverage? What would that take? And is it anything short of a body, quite frankly?
Well, sure. I mean, there's that side of it. If there was a precipitous development providing conclusive evidence, then of course, all bets are off then at that. And but on the other hand, if it is the continuation of this kind of glacial paced change in attitude, I think just as we're seeing some glaciers kind of slip as the melting takes place, it kind of boils down to Kuhn's statement. Kuhn, who coined the term paradigm shift and made the point that sometimes it requires an entire generation to pass before a new paradigm can take root and totally displace, old ways of thinking. I just did an interview for the Wall Street Journal, and they produced, I was one of several people who were interviewed. It wasn't a feature on Dr. Meldrum, but it was a very objective, open-minded treatment of the topic, with acknowledgement that there are serious people, some with academic credentials, some with other professional credentials, some with just good common sense, that are open-minded about the topic. That's a sign of the changing times. I just fielded an email from a master student in a well-established anthropology program doing field research in primatology, and she introduced herself as an inquiring student who is fascinated by this topic and wants to learn more, and how can she get involved? And I had a student, we had a visiting assistant professor who had taken her degree from a very well-reputationed, a very strong anthropology program. She was in forensic anthropology. Anyway, she was here visiting, getting acquainted, seeing our anatomy suite, and then there was a lull in the conversation. She says, "Can I ask a geeky question?" And I said, "Well, sure. Those are often the best ones." She reaches in her satchel, and out comes a copy of my book. "Would you autograph my book?" It wasn't a, pat yourself on the shoulder. It was a, yes, here's a brand new assistant professor. She's still probably 5 years off from having tenure and some job security to really pursue academic freedom, her interests under the umbrella auspices of academic freedom. But she probably represents a lot of other newly minted PhDs that have interests that are not interests in this topic, that are not indoctrinated by the old paradigm that this is just tabloid, that there is, so much has changed. I like to say science has finally caught up with the topic, because the context, if Patterson had come forward with his film this year instead of 55 years ago, it would have been a completely different reception, a different story altogether, a different outcome. I mean, there still would have been skepticism and so on. And especially, well, I mean, I'm just speaking, juxtaposing with the prevailing scientific context. I mean, juxtaposing against the current prevailing technical abilities to create fake films, fake, what is it called when they can
create? For sure, CGI and even practical effects advancements that were not available during Patterson-Gimlin.
Exactly. But if we could just switch the current anthropological understanding of the fossil record of hominin evolution, if we could put that back in 1967, juxtaposed with the limitations on all of those skills, technologies that would be used in faking a film like that, it would have been a very different conversation.
Just to clarify, what you're saying is that if Patterson-Gimlin had been released today, we might have more technological, practical effects to have created a suit, but scientists, anthropologists would have a stronger appreciation and place more of a serious eye on that footage.
One of the presentations, the prepared presentations that I give, that I really enjoy sharing because it's so perception changing, I think, is considering the Patterson-Gimlin film with this 2020 hindsight, this retrospective, and really looking at how the film, so many aspects, so many combinations of traits, like the small brain, but the bipedal limbs, which were stumbling blocks for some of the scientists, even the more open-minded, like John Napier. It was counterintuitive 55 years ago. It cut against the grain of the prevailing paradigms. But now, in hindsight, we see that all these different combinations of traits unexpectedly anticipated what we now understand. Even that one, just to illustrate that one, Napier in his book, which was one of the first academic treatments, I mean, other than Ivan Sanderson's, academic treatments of the topic by a bona fide primatologist, physical anthropologist, he still came down, thumbs down on the Patterson-Gimlin film, but he acknowledged he couldn't really put his finger on anything except when he looked at the film, he said he saw something that from the waist up looked essentially like an ape, but from the waist down was like a human. It was inconceivable to him that such a hybrid of structure would exist in nature. Well, just a few years later, that was in, I think, 72 that his book came out. A few years later, the public discussions about Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. The first time we had more associated skeletal remains, and we could see the pelvis, we could see the knee, we could see the cranium and the jaw and so forth. And how did they describe it in the public press? Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, wait a minute. That was the linchpin in Napier's mind that prevented him from accepting what he saw on that screen as being legitimate. What if he had written that book, 5 years later? What would his opinion have been at that time then? How would he have perceived of it? And the list goes right down. Things that back then they would, the skeptics would look at and say, this is silly, this doesn't make any sense at all. Now it makes absolute sense.
It's fascinating because it's, in a way, and I used this word disclosure when I was chatting with you and in the promotional graphic, really just as a shortcut to say, what would it take for us to be seriously looking at this topic? But in a way, we kind of had that disclosure 55 years ago, and we had it too good, and we just didn't really appreciate it. Right. And now there's been so much baggage placed on top of this footage that even though you might look at it seriously, there's still enough people that are like, oh, well, but it was debunked and the guys came out as a hoax, and another guy came out and said that he put the footprints, and it's just gained this detritus attached to it.
Exactly. It does, and it just weighs it down. It's hard to get that fresh, unadulterated look at it.
Ooh,
Yeah.
man. Finally, I'm just curious because you have said this, and obviously because you are a active academic, and you also additionally wrote a guide, Dr. Meldrum's youth guide for
Yeah.
exploring this topic. Just
Yeah.
leave people with, even if they are not necessarily able to go pursue a degree in this and higher education,
Right.
let's face it, no one's let me preface this that it somewhat frustrates me as someone that went into debt pursuing higher education when I see people tossing around labels such as demonologist and cryptozoologist. I'm a little bit peeved about that at times, but how might a student
Right.
or someone that is able to take classes pursue the study of Sasquatch academically and perhaps truly gain knowledge and maybe even contribute to the field?
Right. Well, first, I would say watch out for these fly-by-night online degrees that there's a couple out there that offer degrees in cryptozoology and supposedly award bona fide higher degrees, masters and PhDs, which don't have any of the rigor, any of the requirements of a legitimate credentialed institution. So watch out for that. I tell students that, and especially to look at my career, look at what I endured and survived by the skin of my teeth in some instances, and instead of diving into the deep end of the pool there, I encourage students to choose. I mean, this has got to be a career. And so you can't make your career entirely on this topic. You need to, and you shouldn't, I think. I mean, you should bring to this topic skills and expertise that will help us to understand and to elucidate the question. And so, choose an area that you find fascinating, that is related to or tangential to somehow this question, whether it's tracking, whether it's DNA sequencing, whether it's bioacoustics, wildlife biology, et cetera, and then become the best that you can be in that discipline. Establish yourself. If you go into academia, get tenure, get published, get recognized for your contributions based on your skills. And then when you have that job security, turn your skills and interests to this question and approach it from a position of authority and respect, the respect of your colleagues. And I've had people say that, actually say, well, Meldrum he's done this, he's done that, he's made important contributions in the study of hominid footprints and foot morphology. If he takes this serious, maybe there is something to it. Maybe I should look at it more closely. Anyway, so I think that's the way that you do it. And I think as we try to cultivate this notion of citizen science too, that there are these, like you say, some different pathways. You don't necessarily have to be possess those letters behind your name, a degree, to do good science. You can. I've worked with lots of people who are largely self-taught, who are very insightful, very rational and objective in their interpretation of their experiences and the evidence they encounter and so forth. And they bring. That's why I always hate to use the word amateur for a quote non-professional investigator. Because they are often highly skilled, much more so in some areas than I am, whether it's electronics or photography or tracking or you name it. They may bring remarkable skills and experience to the table and make very significant contributions. And so to also help at a younger age to really get the young readers and enthusiasts on the right path, I launched a series for if you can read, age 8, basically 8 to adulthood. Originally, I was going to just make it for the pre-high school age, but the result was so engaging. I came into contact with an artist that we just clicked, and his technique I really liked, and so I would compose these learning activity books that incorporated all kinds of science, whether geography and biology and even ethnography, and so there are maps, there are depictions of native peoples and their interpretation. So masks, ceremonial masks, and different things like that. There are all sorts of learning activities. My wife is a K through 12 educator, now retired, but so she helped me with the desired learning outcomes and what the standards were for the different age groups and so forth. And so there's word searches, there's puzzles, there's all kinds of activities, and of course places to color and draw your own experiences and whatnot. I had so much fun with the Sasquatch edition that before the artist was even done with the final composition, redraw of my rough composition, I had the one for the Yeti already designed, and then we just kept the ball rolling, and so there are 5 editions to represent 5 of the potential relic hominoids from around the world. I even tackled the Yowie, which I've sometimes shied away from, but I laid it out there as I see it. And for me, the biggest problem with the Yowie is exemplified on the page, where there's about 6 different variations of footprints. Some with 3 toes, some with 4 toes, some with 5 toes, some that look like a kangaroo, some that look like an ape with a divergent toe sticking out. There's just no consistency in the footprint fossil record, or the footprint record of the Yowie. And so that is a real stumbling block for me to get around, because that trace evidence is really, really significant in my mind. Anyway,
the problem with Yowie,
you'll have to look them up. They're published by Paradise K with a C-A-Y.
That's so the publishing company.
Parak.com. And they've got quite a selection, if you've not visited their webpage, of all sorts of Bigfoot-related topics. They've really gotten into the genre, and in addition to all their other, they specialize in field guides and ocean maps and so forth. They're located over on the California coast. And Bigfoot has become a big element of their offerings, and my books feature in there as well.
I will most certainly have to check it out. And sir, I appreciate your time. This is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He's a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. His research centers on the evolution of hominin, bipedalism. Of course, we're talking about Bigfoot. Not just Bigfoot, but relic hominoids. So, Jeff, it was truly just such a pleasure speaking with you, and I could keep this going, but I will relinquish your time back to you, sir. Anytime whatsoever you want to come nerd out and talk about this topic, you let me know. I am totally down for it.
Will do. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. And that was my interview from 2022 with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Hope you enjoyed it, hearing him talk about a topic that he's quite passionate about. It's funny because he is so serious about this, he would at times get a little lengthy in his responses, and you would hear me kind of try to condense it a little bit. But this is clearly a guy that gets excited about what he's talking about and takes it very seriously. And he is a loss. Definitely RIP, rest in power to Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who contributed so much to academics and to Bigfoot research. So we'll be back with interviews on the next episode. In the meantime, this has been Talking Strange. I'm Aaron Sagers. Be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.